And we're back for another episode of the Conscious Queries podcast. I'm your host, Dominic Persicino. Thanks for joining us. Make sure to like and subscribe on all the platforms. Here today, I have a very special guest for our 9th episode of the podcast. With me today is Dr. Alan Mills. Dr. Alan Mills is a professor at the University of Winnipeg and specializes in politics and global politics. So let's hear a bit about Dr. Allen. Would you like to give us a bit about your background before we get started?
Well, just to explain that actually I'm retired now.
Right.
I'm a retired professor of political science, and in these early years of retirement, the University of Winnipeg gave me the rather exalted title of being a senior scholar. I'm certainly senior. I leave it to listeners to decide whether I'm a scholar. My background is that I grew up in the British Isles. My father was in the English-British Navy. We moved around a great deal. Even as a child, I spent a year and a half living in Hong Kong in the mid-1950s. When he left the Navy, we ended up going to live in Belfast in Northern Ireland, so that I have some experience of the Irish Troubles. From Belfast, I moved to Dublin when I went to university at Trinity College, Dublin. I was footloose and uncertain what my identity was in terms of my nationality, actually. Was I Irish? Was I Northern Irish? Was I English? My mother was Scottish. I was born in Scotland. And I suppose, feeling a little bit footloose, I was open to traveling across the Atlantic to do graduate work at York University. So I switched from studying history to political science and went to York University, then to University of Western Ontario, as we used to call it, to do a PhD. And out of the blue was asked to see if I was available to become a professor at University of Winnipeg. And here I came in 1971, and in spite of all my efforts, I've remained.
Very good.
So I taught at the Department of Political Science for 47 years, mainly in the area of Canadian politics, political philosophy, political theory, those kinds of areas, and published 2 books that I'm very proud of. One, a book on James Shaver Woodsworth, the first leader of the CCF, the forerunner of the NDP. And the second one, which came out just 4 years ago, on Pierre Elliott Trudeau, looking at the years when Trudeau was emerging as a public intellectual in Quebec before he went into politics in 1965. It's a book that I'm quite proud of. When I look at it again, I notice sort of weaknesses in it, but life moves on, and even one's understanding of Pierre Elliott Trudeau changes. But those are my areas. I'm interested in the kind of intellectual foundations of politics, such as they are, and in the Canadian context particularly. So I've been interested in the sort of centre-left, liberalism, social democracy, socialism, and so on, those kinds of areas. Well, you know, presently I'm looking for maybe another issue to write about, but it hasn't quite emerged yet. Instead of that, I become interested in a vast range of things that, you know, I've always had slight interest in: art, architecture, other parts of social theory, the political world, and of course this strange world of COVID that we now live in.
Right. And it's crazy how it's affecting, one thing in one place can affect the entire world now. And that realization is, I think, one of the domino effects that's going to, lead to actions on climate change and, people actually really realizing that, we need to be a bit more responsible with the earth and with, how we conduct ourselves.
Yes, I think that's true. I think the climate change crisis and all the issues relating to climate change have, in some senses, sort of sprung up intensively in the last 10 years. But I think it is that people that were aware of these things for some time ago have been aware of them for a long time. And of course, it is the great challenge, along with several other interrelated challenges that confront the human race.
Right, and it was only when the financial part became in trouble that they looked at the environment and said, well, this might be causing us to lose profit, so this is something we might have to look at. It's unfortunate that it's at that point where it took the loss of profit for private entities to be interested in trying to fix the problem or trying to start fixing it, which they talk a lot about how the private sector is innovative on its own, but sometimes it fails and it takes advantage of it's easy to pollute and then pay a fraction of the price it costs to fix it, actually just in a fine. So instead of putting these arbitrary fines that for them is just a cost of doing business for them to make a lot of profit. I mean, it's really unfortunate that we're at that point now, but I don't know, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, several thoughts suddenly come to my mind. Let me just say this. The argument against believing that the market and free enterprise can solve the problem, I think runs into difficulty when you think about the issue of what economists call externalities. Externalities are the sort of costs of economic activity that can't, for example, be privatized. So you have then businesses that pollute the air that we breathe, they pollute the water that we would want to drink, and other kinds of forms of pollution, but we can't put a dollar cost, or at least we can't allocate a dollar cost to the people that are doing the polluting. So that, corporations don't pay if they pollute a river necessarily, or pollute a lake, or, the mine causes massive problems with the geological structure of the neighborhood or whatever. So until we can do that, it seems to me the market can't solve the problem. So that we resort then, I think understandably, to thinking about what government can do, because government in the public interest can, if you like, be the voice for, if you like, the cost to society at large of environmental damage. I'm thinking of buying a car right now. I say to myself, should I try and invest in an electric car, for example, to do my little bit? This would be, if you like, me following the implications of the marketplace, that essentially, if you like, good citizenship, a good consumership is to think about buying an electric vehicle. But of course, they are still hugely impractical. The range before you have to recharge the battery is rather limited. In Winnipeg, you might be able to get a round trip to Victoria Beach, but that might be a little bit dodgy. And so it is that, even thinking of market solutions, buying into, Mr. what's his name, the producer of the Tesla vehicle, Elon Musk. Elon Musk. I mean, maybe that is a kind of market solution. People say, aha, yes, we must go electric, and they buy Mr. Musk's cars. But it's all still very early days, isn't it? And it's very, very slow. And maybe it is that government should give some kind of incentive, as I think they are doing, for purchasing these kinds of cars. But it's still a long way from dealing with the problem. As we look at the environmental catastrophe that we're confronting, it is that the problems are so huge, and the response so far is still so limited, that we still can't see our way to doing anything substantial about it.
Right, and even with electric cars, it's kind of, unfortunately, we like to think that it's doing a lot of good, but we have to think, where does that all those lithium batteries come from? They come from a mine in Africa somewhere, and it's devastating the ecosystem there. So there's always putting away or hiding away the dirty work, so we don't have to look at it, but we feel good putting an electric tube in my car and saying we're not using fossil fuels anymore. But at the same time, it's like, well, we maybe it's a quick fix or just a band-aid on a bigger issue. That it's materialism is kind of a flaw of humanity, but it's part of the physics of our universe. We need to consume energy. We need all these things. We need to move around. We need vehicles. So it's very difficult to balance the practicality of life, or even the progress of space innovation, or the future of mankind, and say what's the environmental impacts on 8 billion people being on the earth, or having raising everybody, all those 8 billion, out of developing countries into industrialized countries, where if everybody lives like in North America, that would be quite devastating for the environment. So we have to kind of reevaluate what the values are of Western society. What do we need to preserve, and what we need to get rid of or improve in some way? What do you think of all this?
Well, I think what you're describing is, if you like, an existential crisis, a crisis of meaning of either Western society or global industrial society, however you want to define it. If you think about what we think of as industrial society, we can take a date roughly around 1800, when before that pretty well everybody else in the world lived by farming, lived in some kind of agricultural existence, different forms of that agricultural society, but it was basically you lived from the land, you labored hard to grow the crops and harvest them and that kind of thing. Life was hard, labor was hard, disease was rampant, we know that. We know about epidemics of other times. It wasn't easy. Many children died women gave birth, but they either died in childbirth or their children died soon after they were born.
Yeah.
It was a life of suffering.
Yeah.
And then along comes the Industrial Revolution. It starts in England, Britain, and it, of course, expands to Europe, to North America, and now, of course, we have to say that industrialism has taken in the globe. When you think about the developments in the last 30, 40 years in India and China, and even in places like Indonesia and so on, yes?
Right.
So we have a global industrial system. And, well, in many respects, of course, because it made us all relatively wealthy, it allowed us to improve the world circumstances of pretty well everyone. And what you notice as well, the demographic graphs are incredible, because the growth of human population up until about 1800 is almost flat, with a slight increase, an absolutely flat but slight increase. And then roughly after 1800, it's almost goes vertical.
Right.
It's a peak. And of course, one of the beneficial effects of industrialism is that it allows us to develop medicine to an incredible degree. Medicine is one of the hugely significant triumphs of the human race in the last 100 years. Even before, say, 1920, doctors could do very little for you if you were sick.
Right.
There was some.
When you go to the dentist, he would give you a bottle of liquor, and that would be the medicine.
That's right. You didn't want to go to the dentist unless you really had to.
Right.
I even am old enough to remember those sort of incredible drills, that were, drilling your teeth, and often as well without any kind of painkiller in your jaw. But anyway, we've seen incredible medical improvements, a vast increase in the size of the world's population. Where is it now? Anywhere around 7-8 billion people. And it is, of course, that while the birth rate has come down in large parts of the world, it's still higher than replacement levels in particularly parts of Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. So that we're thinking about maybe a stabilizing of world population at around, is it 8 or 8.5 billion around 2050. I mean,
Right.
finally, the rapidly growing parts of the population have by then decided that, you know, 2 kids in a family is roughly a good idea, so that we will be stable, but at a very high level. I remember James Lovelock, the famous Gaia theorist of environmentalism. I don't know whether you come across his writings. Very important figure. He said he thought the carrying capacity of the Earth was 1 billion people.
Wow.
If that's true, we've got 7 billion more in
Right.
the offing. Now, of course, this industrial system needed massive energy in order to somehow provide industrial production throughout the globe. Where do we get it? Well, we've gotten it from oil, haven't we? Originally from coal, a little bit from other sources, you know, running water early on, but quickly moved to, you know, carbon-based energy supplies, oil, natural gas, coal, and of course, out of that has come the greenhouse gases that are heating the earth. And of course, you know, someone decided around about 1920, was that Henry Ford? Wouldn't it be a nice idea to give all these people a little buggy to drive around in? It's actually a great idea when you think about it. I mean, my little buggy got me to your studio today, you know, 10 miles away from the other side of Winnipeg.
Right.
I wouldn't have been able to come without my little car.
Exactly.
And so on. So, but if one's going to get a little car, why shouldn't everybody get one?
And then that fell to the need of, we need to have an infrastructure of roads that are not just dirt, that we
Correct.
need, you know, yeah.
And you have, you know, the whole superstructure then of the automobile industry. Well, all right, it in many ways, I think, has destroyed modern cities. I mean, I honestly believe, am I an antiquarian in this regard, that the most beautiful cities are the ones that were built before the coming of the automobile.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at, say, Paris in the late 19th century,
Right.
London. I'm very fond of the city of Prague in the Czech Republic. I spent a lot of time there. Its beauty is because, of course, its structure and layout was
Right.
before the coming of the automobile.
It's a lot nicer when you're in those European cities and, you know, the market's just across the street and the theater's just down the block. So it's a lot more centralized, or you don't, you know, in Canada where it's like, okay, we're going to Costco today, so we're going 10 kilometers and then we're going to Selkirk, or we're traveling major distances, as opposed to average human beings in a lot of other places where they just stay in a small area of town, which, I mean, it makes a lot more sense, you know, why have everything so spread out? I mean, this is why it was, you know, all of North America was designed that way, you know, it's all giant streets and everything's very separated and apart, where in Europe everything's all you know, closer together. So I mean, it makes a lot more sense for human beings, but I guess the combination of not enough public transport and the long winters make the freedom of cars just so appealing to North America. So,
well, especially in a city like Winnipeg.
Right.
But when you look at Winnipeg, there is, in fact, gathering density in the sort of inner city and the downtown. I mean, I live in the center of the city, and I notice the rather large amount of infill housing that's going on. Frankly, I much prefer to live surrounded by people.
Right.
I mean, I have skyscraper apartment buildings on the Winnipeg model,
Right.
overlooking my house. I don't mind that. I keep the curtains closed, of course, at night. But it is that for much of Winnipeg's development and the development of most American cities, North American cities, it is that land was cheap and everybody seemed to want a nice home in the suburbs with a little garden.
Right.
And how do you sort of get from your place of work downtown to the suburbs except by, well, some kind of mass transportation. Now, you can do it, I suppose, through public transport, buses, railways, undergrounds. But the automobile was also very, very attractive. You didn't need to share your space with anybody, and you could drive to work. But of course, along with that comes the shaping of the modern city, spread out with massive amounts of parking lots to accommodate all these cars. I mean, a blight on the eyesight of the world.
Right.
Um,
I wonder if
so,
there were stables before everywhere.
well, there were, but not too many people had horses. That
Right,
was the
right.
advantage. Now, presumably, there were problems. I mean, the horses left, their refuse in the street.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose you had to be careful where you walked. But it was, though, that people didn't generally have too many horses because, well, they were a feature of the aristocracy mainly, or the early bourgeoisie in the cities.
Right.
And it was fun. You could imagine riding in a carriage drawn by a horse, and it features in Marcel Proust's famous series of novels, you remember, on the eve of the First World War in Paris. But along comes the automobile in the 1920s and takes over, and of course horses are a thing of the past.
Right. It's funny because now, even more where it's only the extremely wealthy that could afford horses and to maintain them and everything. Where, the vast majority of people can only afford a vehicle that's more humble than than a very expensive car, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
I got to tell you, I remember a dinner party. I had a very close friend who was an anthropologist at the University of Winnipeg, and back in the 1980s, we used to have dinner parties at his house. And I remember one famous dinner party where this fellow said, he said, if China begins to consume at the level that we consume in the West, it's over completely for the world environment. Now, of course, that's the great story of recent modern history, China's change from being a relatively agricultural society until roughly, about 1980. Mao has died in 1976, and then there's some, sorting out of the leadership of the Communist Party of China. And then Deng Xiaoping takes over and creates this massive surge of industrialization in 30 years. I was in China about 10 years ago. I could not believe the freedom that the authorities had to simply redesign the whole environment of cities and the wider countryside. Just unbelievable. Of course, it was possible because individual Chinese people didn't have rights. They didn't have rights of ownership of property to say, no, you can't do this with my land, or no, you have to get my approval for driving a highway through my back garden.
right.
But anyway, they did it. They did it in their rather sort of draconian way. We now have China as this massively important industrial society. In many ways, it's taken over industrialization from the West.
Which is very terrifying, where we see everybody saying, well, there's money to be made there, so we should go with them. It's like, well, there's money to be made because they've industrialized themselves using many, unethical practices where, there's probably still child labor, there's, all sorts of atrocities going on. And of course, if we use slave labor, it's going to be cheaper. There's no questioning that. But I mean, I think that's the point where we need to set capitalism the boundaries of ethics, where we say we don't tolerate, slavery. We don't tolerate paying people not a living wage, or we shouldn't tolerate these kinds of things where we don't treat the individual with the basic of dignity as human beings should get, right?
But here's the problem, and here's another of the dilemmas that confront the human race. We are very aware, I think, and increasingly aware of the drawbacks of a capitalist economy.
Right. Everything, most of the things in our society are made in China, so it's
Well,
very difficult to walk away.
Well, it's difficult to walk away from whatever it is they have in China. Now, is it capitalism? Is it state capitalism?
Right.
It's a mix of a sort of socialism and a command economy, and also obviously elements of private ownership and initiative and a market of sorts. But look, capitalism is broader than China. It's part of India. It's part of Indonesia. It's part of everywhere.
Right.
Now, all right, we are aware of its difficulties, It seems to be
But
sort of
isn't there
endlessly
enough?
committed to growth. You have
Right.
to keep growing. You can't stop growing.
Isn't there enough
Um,
competition to go around where instead of giving all the contracts to China, we can give some to India or the Philippines? Like, why is it always they always can provide the best deals? Why
Well,
is that?
policymakers in the West are obviously confronted now with a very, very big question, not just COVID, not
Right.
just the climate crisis, but also relations with China, particularly. China is this huge, gigantic economic power. It is significant because, of course, it has what is it, a billion, 2 billion, 3 people. It has a market of its own.
Right.
It doesn't really need to depend upon the West to buy its products. China has used, I think, probably pretty sort of dodgy tactics to kind of advance its cause within the world economy. I'm not sure it quite uses slave labor most of the time. I think what you have is a sort of rather intensively driven, regimented capitalist economy. Lots of workers living in barrack like conditions. Um, Certainly, the movement of labor is regulated there. The state itself is pretty kind of authoritarian, particularly towards minorities. We know what's happening with is it the Uyghurs? There's an ongoing problem with how it's dealt with Tibet. But even so, all right, so we have capitalism with all of its failings, unequal distribution of wealth, concentration, particularly in the upper levels
Right.
of those who own wealth, the degradation of the environment, ruthless competition, the need to endlessly grow. I mean, Marx, to some degree, Karl Marx saw all this when he wrote his famous Communist Manifesto in 1848. The great beauty of capitalism is that it is this dynamic force that changes the world, grows the economy, in fact, possibly enlarges people's incomes. They're better
Right.
off materially. All right, we know its difficulties though. What is the alternative? Well, we've thought of as a sort of version of socialism as the alternative. The trouble is, of course, that the experience of pure socialism in the form of the Soviet Union after 1917 until its collapse in 1989 is that this didn't work very well either.
No.
It was a command economy. People had no freedom. They had no mobility.
There's no motivation.
There was corruption,
Yeah.
among the apparatchiks and the people that ran the state. And so the problem facing us, I don't want to be too pessimistic, is that, we seem to have run out of clear alternatives. Now, there are, if you will, versions of a kind of humanized, moralized capitalism with a social conscience and a concern for the environment. I call these positions in the world economy social democracy of different kinds.
Right.
I think, when you look at Canada, you see, I think, the Greens, I think the NDP, and the Liberal Party on a good day can be thought of as instances of this social democracy. The trouble is, how do we move quickly enough to deal with all the problems that confront us? Because mobilizing masses of people is very, very hard.
Right. It's the democratization of capitalism, and well, see, this is where there's big monopolies that if you go to the grocery stores, it's 5 companies own all the products on the shelf. And Microsoft just bought off other companies, so we're getting to the point where we have such giant monopolies that control giant sectors of the industries, where it's anyone that wants to compete with Starbucks has no chance of opening up a independent coffee shop in the same block as a Starbucks. It's become a problem, and I think we talk about the really big gap in wealth, where 2,000 American billionaires own 40% of the world's wealth, which is an immense amount of control, especially in the United States, where money has been declared free speech, and where basically whoever has the most money can lobby the government more. And to me, it seems I can't claim full it's not my idea, but I just came across this idea where, what if we could not not necessarily a tax, but it would be a kind of an expiry date on immense wealth, where if you're making over 100 million, and that money has an expiry date where you have to spend it within 5 years or within a certain amount of time, or you can't just hoard it or keep it all in a vault. You have to redistribute it. You have to do something with it, start new businesses or start, you know. And I think maybe that's a way of getting rid of the problem, instead of just taking it away from them and saying, well, you know, the economy relies on the stimulation and the moving of money. And so if the capital isn't moving, if it's just 4 or 5 people that own everything, nobody else can work, no one else can innovate new ideas. So maybe that's a solution where we can fairly say, you've made enough, you have 4 cottages now, you have, how many cars do you need, how much is enough, right?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, we see the problem very, very clearly. We know how unequal wealth distribution is, and I think we know the various kind of package of policies that might deal with it. The question is, how do you develop a politics that allows you to, or ensures that you will achieve those kinds of goals?
Right.
I mean, you mentioned the fact that that money or corporations are considered persons in the United States, and therefore they have
Terrifying
certain rights.
notion.
And of course, it's allowed the Supreme Court to deny any attempt to regulate campaign contributions and how much money sort of sloshes around in the American electoral system.
Right.
I mean, I think there are sort of simpler ways of dealing with the problem than simply, I don't know, saying that at a certain point rich people have to give up all they have. I think the problem is a tax system is incredibly unfair in almost all the Western countries. I'm not even talking about Russia or India or China. I mean, I think we've had an evolution of the tax system, little bits done here and there. So we have the absurdity, and I think it's quite legal, of Donald Trump not paying any taxes even though he's a billionaire. I mean, I think his defense will be, if he could ever bring himself to speak coherently for a moment, yes, it's all legal. It's all legal, you know, tax write-offs, depreciation allowances, declaring losses and all that kind of thing.
And but unfortunately, he said...
So you get the situation, as Warren Buffett points out, where he pays less tax than the cleaning lady that looks after his house.
Because they can afford better finance advisors than
it's
anyone
that
else
as
can.
well. They have accountants that can help them.
And it's a lot easier if you can move your money internationally. That's a big tactic as well. I remember they were saying that Donald Trump paid more taxes in other countries than he did in America because of how his financial holdings are. I think that's the problem, where we allow that kind of financial, I don't know, irresponsibility, where we, if we're at the point where, why is even the middle class, why should we even have an income tax on a middle class when we could easily make the same amount from Microsoft, and Microsoft wouldn't even notice any. It would for them, it would be in the losses, and it wouldn't even affect them. So, what's the big leap now, where we have, we want to regulate businesses, but we don't want to over-regulate so that they all leave the country and don't want to do business here. But I mean, at the same time, if they don't want to do business, that just gives us more opportunity to start grassroots businesses and start maybe cooperatives, or start local businesses that are, the profits stay in the community. Because when we buy from Amazon, or when we buy from those places, the profits go back to California. They don't stay in Winnipeg. They don't go to my community. And I think this is why, more and more the middle class is shrinking, where we're not seeing wealth being kept here. It's all going away in a few pockets in America because they have the monopoly, unfortunately.
Well, but it does seem as well that those that have wealth are able basically to control the politicians. I mean, I am quite deterministic about this. And it is that, the way in which political parties are set up in Western liberal democracies, so-called, it is that they are very dependent on private donations. And as well as that, they don't want to offend those who, if you like, are potentially the louder voices. I always remember David Lewis, the leader of the NDP back in the early 1970s, publishing a book about what he called corporate welfare, but he talked about the louder voices.
Right.
Why is it that the voices of the poor are sort of silent? Whereas, of course, when Trudeau's
a bank
government
fails, we bail them out.
Well, that's right. Or when Trudeau finally, with Morneau, decided to try and deal with this issue of the way in which professionals in this country, doctors, lawyers, and so on, used the tax system to spread their income to their wives and so on and family, that promoted such a reaction that they backed off to some extent anyway. These are the louder voices of people with money. It's always the case, it seems to me, or much of the time, it is that in the end, the middle class, particularly the suburban middle class in Western liberal democracies, tend in the crisis to side with the wealthy rather than the poor, if we can put it that way. All right?
Right.
It is a dilemma. Every now and then, you find a real sort of movement of sort of center-left initiative that somehow identifies the middle class and the poor together. But it's the exception to the rule, sadly, I think.
And I mean, it's to the point where it's kind of, Bernie Sanders says it so well. When I've listened to an 8-hour filibuster he did, and it's just magnificent, where he says, it's unacceptable for somebody to work in the United States or in Canada, working 40 hours a week and still being under the poverty line. That is like ridiculous, where you can't afford food and rent and insurance on a full-time salary. That is, to me, where have we gone, where inflation has gone so high and wages are still not catching up with that, and it's funny because there's the generational conflict where boomers blame a lot of the millennials for killing industries. It's like, well, we can't afford anything. Of course their businesses aren't going to survive. We can't buy houses. We can't afford these things. So you're going to have a hard time finding customers. It's like, maybe if you paid your employees more, they would spend more money on your businesses. So it's the whole catch-22 where businesses need to be paying more. If they want to make more profits, they pay more. But then again, we get into the issue of inflation. And it's almost impossible to force a company to say, all right, we're going to raise wages, now keep inflation where it is. And it's like, I'm going to raise my prices. I'm like, can you please not do that? Or they don't.
Well, it's also the case that we exist in a global market, a global competitive market,
which means that there's
and how can you
can't control
expect
it.
to raise wages in Canada when you're competing with Chinese workers that are earning a third or lower, a quarter only of what people are earning here.
Right.
In some kind of really sort of impoverished economies, they're working for even less compared to Canadians.
Right, and then that's the pride of buying local,
in Bangladesh or something like that.
Right. I think that that we have to have that pride of buying local or supporting Canadian businesses. And I think of course, the entire 20th century is a perfect example of why nationalism has its flaws and it's can go very badly. But at the same time, nationalism, where it's a chance for us to come as a team and unite us, where we can work together to, it's a good way to organize ourselves, and it's worked in the past. And if we can have the idea where we need to support our neighbors' business instead of going and paying the extra few dollars, instead of going off and supporting Amazon or things like that, which is a very difficult thing to do, especially with the wages not coming back. So it's very difficult for people to maintain the quality of life and help support local businesses as opposed to going to Walmart, right?
Well, I would support buy local and buy national. Um, I mean by BUY, buy
Right, right,
national,
right.
buy local. But I think there's a limit to it as well.
Yeah,
I mean, you can't grow oranges in Manitoba.
exactly. There has to be some
You
trade.
can't grow coffee.
Yeah,
I mean, I take it we would still want our orange juice and our coffee in the morning with breakfast.
right.
So there has to be world trade.
Of course.
But it is absurd that, because China has such a, sort of low level of labor costs, it can essentially, outcompete Canadian manufacturers. Let's say in, say, furniture manufacturing, right?
Right.
I mean, why would you want to sort of send all that wood to China across the sea and then bring it back in the form of finished goods as furniture?
Right.
Think of the costs of transporting both ways, and yet it is that it's still cheaper to produce and manufacture than something locally produced in Canada,
Right.
where we have the wood,
Right.
and God, we used to have the expertise. I mean, there were massive, important furniture industries in places like Montreal and Toronto and Winnipeg too. You know what I mean? We had a garment industry in Winnipeg once.
Right. It's
Hard to compete with Bangladesh
I feel like
unless you're Phil not Mr. Nygaard.
right.
There you are.
It's I feel like it's very difficult, or I feel like the values of people have changed over time, where before people liked to wear fur coats, people liked very nice finished artisan furniture, or like, people liked the details of everything. And the 20th century, the Victorian era is a product of that. People liked columns and castle houses. They like to spend their wealth, and they had money to spend. But it seems that now people have been to they've decided things aren't as important, or objects, it's a throwaway culture more than, oh, if something broke down, I'm gonna go and fix it. I'm gonna it's a lot cheaper. If this breaks, chances are it's gonna cost more to fix it than to buy a new one.
We all know that.
It's really unfortunate.
You never think about bringing a repairman in when your washing machine breaks down.
Right.
It's going to cost you more than to have it simply replaced. Yeah.
Which is, unfortunate, where that's the predicament we're in, where it's the throwaway culture is, we get our furniture at IKEA instead of a named artist that would make desks, one by one, where of course it costs more money, but that desk would last you generations, not 5 years, right? So I mean,
No,
that's the
It's
quality. To me, I like the idea of having an object for a generation, but it seems that that's not the majority's values right now.
Well, I wonder how much the majority sort of really think about it ever,
To be self-sustaining or responsible.
As opposed to simply roughly going along and adapting to what exists.
Yeah.
I think the terrible dilemma for each of us individually is, do we make any difference? You know what I mean? So, we try and make a little bit of a difference. So some of us try to compost, so we don't throw our vegetables and stuff into the garbage.
Right.
We might think about, protesting the fact that there's so much plastic containers in the grocery store. So we also bring our own bags to the grocery store and not take home plastic bags.
Right.
Mind you, the epidemic's put a bit of a dint in that, hasn't it?
They've shown us that practice is convenient in food, and like everything having plastic wrap
That's right.
is sanitary. So
Yes.
there's the cost
That's right.
benefits of it.
That's correct.
Yeah.
But do I make much of a difference if I insist on taking my own grocery bag to the supermarket? Do I make a difference if I compost? It's infinitesimally small, and I think at a certain point people just don't bother at all.
Right.
Do I make a difference to global greenhouse gases by buying an electric car? I do a bit, but then, as you pointed out, what about the disposal of all these batteries?
Yeah.
And and then there's the cost of building the hydro stations to provide the electricity to charge my battery.
Exactly.
So, I mean, there's obviously complex problems.
Right.
You know, when we look at the problems of industrialization itself, it does raise, I think, as I said earlier, this existential question. How do we go back to living more simply?
And it's very difficult now.
Without consuming much, you know.
And it's unfortunate because the model that a lot of people in Silicon Valley and in the United States want is everything to be subscription based, and it's kind of terrifying to think that maybe, you know, cars are becoming leases, or you're just leasing a car, you're not purchasing a car. Now next thing will be you're leasing your home, you're leasing the city you live in, where there's self-driving cars and services, and everything's provided for you, and all you have to do is pay a monthly fee and you're part of the club. But then, you know, you lose that power and sovereignty over yourself. You lose the control of what you can do, what your outcome is, what your abilities. And, you know, people forget that money isn't wealth. Wealth is the food in your fields or the blankets you have to keep you warm. That's real wealth, because it can give you something.
Well, also social wealth in the
Exactly.
form of you know, happy families, you know, warm friendships.
Right.
And yeah, that's very, very important too. You know, obviously part of the problems of the world are the sort of fraying of these social relationships, particularly during this pandemic. You know, the fact that you know, wife abuse is going up, you know, because of the lockdown and people having to live more closely for longer periods of time. Yeah, wherever we look, it does seem as if the human race has lots of problems. Now
it's a miracle we made it here so far.
That's right. But, you know, I suppose it's good to emphasize the good things, you know.
Right.
So here we are thinking about how to have a vaccine to deal with COVID. And, you know, every time you know, I hear someone say how technology is so destructive, ask yourself that question as you settle into the dentist's chair. All right. I mean, going to the dentist is now a relatively pain-free operation. And what they can do for you, like all forms of medical care, is quite remarkable.
Right.
But it's all because we've developed science, technology, industry, and we're wealthy enough to afford it.
And
you know
it's
what I mean?
a lot of human innovation has been driven by the military and by war. And, you know, those conflicts kind of lead us to be pressed against the wall, where we seem to be at our best when pressed, when under pressure. You know, when we have too much leisure, we seem to waste a lot of our time on leisure, right? So it seems, you know, it's and it seems to be a very good shower of character, where people who lived through those kind of chaotic experiences or traumatic experiences, they have a better understanding of life as a whole, where other people live in their little bubble and never get to experience, you know, the terrors or the pain or the real chaos that could be, where we have to appreciate the peacetime we're in now and all the things that we've accomplished, and not just say, you know, oh, the system's broken and it's all garbage. Well, it's like, well, we've survived so far and it's been quite successful thus far. You know, of course there's corruption, of course there's problems, but I mean, you know, Canada from you know, an international point of view, you know, it's in the top 10, you know, examples of nations in the world, you know. I think even beyond the United States, even.
Well, Canada is actually looking very good right now.
Right.
You know, I've had conversations with my son and daughter in the last few weeks. My son has recently started living with his girlfriend, and I think they're thinking of getting married. He volunteered to me, though he wasn't sure that he wanted to bring a child into the world. And my response to him was to say, well, look, you know, if you want to bring a child into the world, at least in Canada, it's a pretty good project, you know, because Canada's going to be a pretty good place to live. I said the same thing to my daughter. Don't leave Manitoba. It's going to get better here.
Right.
It's going to get warmer. The agricultural frontier will grow further north.
Right.
Will be more productive agriculturally.
Right.
We have more water than we know what to do with. But of course, this is not true for the rest of the world. And the interesting question for young people as they think about living in the 21st century is it worth living in this benevolent place if it is that the rest of the world is going to hell, That's obviously a major problem. And of course, modern media can bring the rest of the world to our doorstep through television every day.
Right. It can be pretty pessimistic to see everything going on, and and I think it's something that we overlook, where the pains of the world still don't take away your troubles in life, right? Your problems, you still have problems in your own life. It's easy to put away and to say, oh well, people have it worse off, therefore I don't need to worry. It's like, well, you should still address your problems that you have, and not just look at other people and just have excuses, right?
Well, and also that even if you are a wealthy society, relatively well run, which I think is a description of Canada, it is that you have those subcultures of poverty and disadvantage that need to be addressed. I mean, homelessness, I think, is a very sad but pressing problem in our own society in Canada.
Especially with the long winters, it's a miracle that
Yes.
We in those positions where it's honestly better for them to be in jail, where they get a hot shower and a meal, than being on the streets in the winter. So you really have to think about criminal recidivism and all the justice system, and how it could have a lot of good reforms. But as well, it seems that I have family members that have a mental illness, and we learned a lot about the history of mental illness and how it was treated in the past, and how they closed all the mental health institutions. They closed because they had a bad reputation of the practices, but then they completely gave up on them and they left them in the streets. And so there's very little infrastructure for people with mental illness or things that make they can't work ever. So it's that kind of problem where we can't. And it's great that we have initiatives like we have Asylum Mission, and we have women's centers for abuse, and we need those things. But we can't forget about how the majority of people that are homeless are men that don't have a family to go to, and it's I hate to do this, but it's a bit like it seems that men have been they've taken the brunt of the force in kind of the early days, and now even so we're still taking the brunt of the force, where suicide rates, men suffer more of suicide rates. Men are the people who die more in their work places of work, and it's kind of I'm all for feminism. I believe in feminism, and we can never go back to a tyrannical patriarchy. I don't believe in that. But it seems to me that extreme matriarchies as well is not going to work as well. It's going to be there, but it's always been like that. There's always an overreaction in social progress, and I think hopefully sooner than later people will come to the conclusion that you just need to treat people better, and we need to step away, I think, from identity politics more, and say we can't divide people up. We can't treat people differently, because that's what's causing resentment. That's what's causing social tension, is treating people like they're different. We can't. I feel like that's the biggest, a big problem that we in America, especially with Black Lives Matter and the police brutality issues. It's those social issues are coming up to the boiling point where there's violence in the streets, and I don't think anybody that's reasonable wants violence in the streets, right?
Well, I think you're right, and since we seem to be in a kind of pessimistic mood, maybe it was the grey skies when I came into your studio, but it is, though, that we are confronting some very serious questions, and we haven't really got to the bottom of all of them. I mean, we haven't talked about drug addiction.
Right.
We've talked a little bit about homelessness, how we treat people with mental disabilities. So there's the issue of addictions. There's the issue of, as you point out, the difficulties of being a man in these kinds of days in which we live. Of course, women can equally say the difficulties of being a woman.
Of course,
but
of course.
All right, so it is that we need to move forward on both gender fronts, I think. Look, I think there's a larger sort of intangible issue, and it's what one famous philosopher calls the loss of meaning in the modern world.
Right.
This is very much a Western phenomenon. I'm not sure it's true of India,
right,
or Indonesia, or China even, although maybe a growing story in China. But it is that the sense of meaning that most people have had in most epochs has been something provided by religion.
Right.
And in the West, we seem to have increasingly undermined belief in religion of whatever kind.
Right.
People hang on in different kinds of ways, but it's often a very sort of limited version of Christianity or Judaism or whatever.
We've become very secular as a culture.
We've become very, very secular.
Yeah.
And, even the belief in some religious traditions is rather limited. You sort of... I always remember the lovely little phrase that people continue to be Christians because of three things, what they call hatch, match, and dispatch, right? You take your kid to be christened when it's born, you get married in a church, and you get buried in a church. But that's all you have to do with the church, right? Hatch, match, and dispatch. So the question then is, if we no longer believe we live in a universe, if you will, commandeered by God or supervised by God, living according to certain kind of religious ethical principles, celebrating certain kind of mythic moments, the Ten Commandments, Moses in the desert, Christ on the cross, Christ rising from the dead, Muhammad taking down some kind of version of what became the Quran. I mean, if we no longer live according to these kinds of mythic moments,
there's no cultural
what do we believe in?
institution that's taken over. Mm-hmm. What do we do with our dead? We bury them, mm-hmm. because that's what we've always done, right? Mm-hmm. It's interesting that, and I think this is very true, but at the same time, maybe more in America or Vancouver on the West Coast, where you have a resurgence of a lot of different, since we don't have any religious persecution, it opens up the idea where maybe we can have spirituality without, mm-hmm. A Christian institution, or maybe we can have spirituality and, think that there are things beyond the universe that we don't know. But it's less of theological, it's less of a doctrine of books, it's more of, mm-hmm. Maybe more pagan practices, or there's a lot of things that are, that can be done.
Well, there are some thinkers who argue, a person whom I've talked about in my classes for a long, long time is Charles Taylor, the famous philosopher from Montreal at McGill.
Right.
Taylor is world respected because of his thinking, writing, and so on. He talks about the great crisis of the loss of meaning. He's also, however, disputed whether we're becoming more and more a secular society, and one of the things he turns to is to point out the forms of New Age spirituality that spring up in all sorts of places. I tend not to agree with him much on that particular issue. I think the New Age stuff is rather shallow. I mean, it's a little bit about
a lot of grifters.
a little bit like sort of, going to yoga, drinking lattes in Starbucks and wondering about the meaning of life. I mean,
Right.
it's not very, very deep, but of course it's the beginning of things, maybe.
I really liked learning from Alan Watts Zen Buddhism and the Eastern practices. It's there's a lot to learn there. I think it would be disingenuous to dismiss a lot of those things. I think they have years and million or maybe thousands of years of knowledge, of accumulated knowledge that the dichotomies and a lot of principles and ideas are very, very, they can be even considered naturalistic or pagan in nature, where the universe can be stranger than we can suppose. It's possible.
Well, I mean, I think there is a sense of the mystery of life if you think about it long enough, and maybe it is that people in their private lives do think about it much more deeply than we give them credit for.
It's more taboo to talk about because you don't want to offend people's religion, or you don't want to.
Well, that's the problem of living in a pluralistic society where all religions have an equal standing. It is that you can't dispute any kind of difficulties that some religions project, let's say. So we become rather sort of limited in our sense of deep spirituality for fear of offending other people. But I suppose it's an ongoing matter. I mean, clearly the Chinese government worries about it. They've tried to rehabilitate the tradition of Confucius. Here you have a communist society that's not supposed to believe in religion, and yet they've gone back to ancient forms of religion in China to try and provide a kind of moral framework for people's lives. Putin in Russia has revived the traditions of the Orthodox Church as a way of giving a kind of moral order to Russia. I mean, it's a shame that he doesn't provide the same moral order to his own government. But,
people they need something to look forward to, or they need something, or they know that there's something beyond that they have to really think about or do some homework about. Where I really like the ancient shamans of South America, where they used ayahuasca and other brews to try and get in touch with the other and the dimensions. And even they talk about this painting right here being a spiritual realm, where it's probably a lot more complicated than just a big human being in the sky. It'd probably be much more as in we're all cells in a human being, or we're all part of a bigger structure, and we're all playing our part, and we're all doing our part, and it's all part of the plan, where you don't have to worry. And this is a big problem with religion, is you do have to worry. You have to be appropriate and do all these things to be accepted. But the real reality is I don't think a God would give me a list of rules and tell me to follow them. I think he would accept me regardless, or he would accept me as I am, and not.
Well, except that other versions of God don't hold to that kind of view.
Right.
Just as in the case of Buddhism, it's not necessarily the case that it believes in God.
Right.
Buddha is not the son of God. He is, in some senses, a kind of seer, a kind of prophet of sorts, seeing the meaning of life a little more deeply than the rest of us. But he doesn't come as the child of God or the son of God, Allah's messenger. He is Buddha.
But maybe there was a misinterpretation of Jesus, where he was saying that we were all the son of, or we're all part of God, right? And there was a misinterpretation where there was a perversion to say he was the exclusive son of God. And I mean, that makes a lot more sense. And especially to me, it's amazing how the church can, the Hammurabi texts come out in the 80s, where the Gospel of Thomas is open to the public, and it talks about the Thomas the doubter, who doubted God and said, I doubt the resurrection. And so Jesus showed him, and he let him touch the wounds. And it was Gospel Thomas that got the ultimate prize of touching God, because he was the one that doubted him. He didn't give him his benevolent belief. He doubted him, so he got the prize. And so this is a big problem for the church, where they say, well, we don't want any doubters. We don't want doubters. We want people who follow the doctrine. And this is, I think, the whole patriarchy and hierarchy falling apart, where, we don't need a person in a house to have a connection with God. Now my connection with God, if I have one, it can be anywhere in the world, because he is omnipresent if he is there, right? So he's not just in one house and the one man reading in Latin, because we've democratized everything. Journalism has been a big part of that, I think. I mean, religion's a really interesting topic for me. I grew up Catholic, but to me, I stepped away from it. I'm spiritual, but I don't really. I see myself more of a maybe like a shamanistic practitioner.
Well, and maybe that's the confirmation of what Charles Taylor's saying, that people have, if you like, fallen away from the established religions and the denominations. But they're still interested in these deep questions, these sort of foundational questions about life, the universe.
And it's unfortunate, I find, that it's only the physicists that get to talk about it. It's
only
them.
The physicists maybe are the great spiritualists,
right?
Talking about quantum theory and the origins of life itself.
And they talk about it so in passing, where they're like, oh, yes, of course, matter is like this. It's like, but what you're describing is a miracle, aren't you? And they're like, oh, well, maybe it's a miracle.
Well, one of the things I love to do is to listen to podcasts from the BBC. And there's a wonderful series called In Our Time. And I was riveted recently listening to a podcast about the origins of the universe. They bring in 3 or 4 experts from different universities to talk about it. And they did bring in Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionary theory. But if you sort of posit the age of the universe at something like 13, 14 billion years, you've got a lot of time to think about how things could have evolved from maybe nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost an absurdity to talk about evolving from nothing. But I was riveted in this program to sort of hear them talking about, the most sort of elementary molecule, as it was self-replicating. This makes lots of sense in the age of COVID, eh?
Right.
As long as it was self-replicating, you could imagine the building up of forms of life from the most simple form of a molecule.
Of course.
Something like that, anyway. Now, this is, I suppose, a sort of fairly spiritual sense, but of course it doesn't need God to be part of the picture, except that, you can always ask that great cosmic question, how did that molecule exist at all?
Exactly.
If you like. But the worry is that our religion is a kind of consumerism. We love to essentially have things. And I include myself in that. It's something I struggle with all the time. The need do we need to have a new pair of shoes this week, or can I not sort of go online and read something that's free rather than buying a book from Amazon? I mean, there's sort of nice consumerism and wretched consumerism,
right.
But no, it is. I mean, thinking of all of those shopping malls that exist to simply satisfy a kind of impulse to buy and purchase.
Right.
And put your hands around something material new for the moment. And it doesn't take much thought to realize that consuming material things is less cosmically significant than exploring the question of the meaning of life.
Right. It's a lot more satisfying in the short term.
Yeah. And of course, after a while, people stop even thinking about the deeper questions.
It's easier to distract yourself with the football game, or watching
Netflix
right
movies, yes.
Right. And it is unfortunate, but at the same time, now we have this way where we can find our niches, or we can go out and find content creators, or find people who pique our interest, or find philosophers online. Because before, it was very difficult where, one personality could give a lecture in one city at a time. Now he can do an online lecture presentation to 10,000 people online at the same time. So it makes it a lot easier to do. But at the same time, human beings are they get a satisfaction from going to a live event, whether it's a symphony or whatever it is, a speakers series, which is, I guess everybody has their fix, right? Everybody has what they like, right? Some people like the football game. I would like to go to, a TED Talk. That would be much more interesting up my alley for me to go to, But now, especially with the new age, it's kind of hard to think, where is it going? Because, now music festivals are out of the question for the next year, maybe who knows how long, until we actually have, a folk fest or a music festival that's, what we had before, which, we're really hoping on that vaccine. But, I think that there's always human beings need, especially now, like before there was we had those maybe not religious institutions, but spiritual, cultural institutions, like the trials of Eleusis in ancient Egypt, or in ancient Greece, where, Marcus Aurelius and all sorts of famous figures, they went there and they had a mystical experience in this ritual ceremony. And it was it's something that human beings are very drawn to, where we're very tribal, we're very, connected to nature, and it seems that we're always driving for that. And especially nowadays, there's no, other than your teachers in school, there's not really any real mentorship, where before, if you were becoming a baker, you would work hours in a bakery, and you would be like under a master chef that would teach you. Now it's very much more, the gig economy. There's nobody really a professional above you that's going to show you the ropes, that's going to mentor you into a position of authority, or build you into an adult. And I think a lot of people my age are looking for mentorship, or looking for people that can tell them what the heck can we be doing right now, and they're not getting that kind of mentorship that past generations, or in the past, there was a lot more prevalent in that regard.
Well, I think we've lost the tradition of apprenticeship.
Yeah.
Just thinking about its application to the economy. No, we haven't gotten away from it completely. I take it that one of the reasons why we have community colleges, such as Red River in Manitoba and Winnipeg and so on, is to provide a substitute for what used to be the apprentice that was hired by a master in an industrial firm or in some kind of craft.
You would actually be working in the field and not
That's
in
right.
school. Yeah.
So the carpenter would take on an apprentice and teach his skill to the
which I think or for myself, I learned better that way. I learned better in the work environment, or instead of, all right, here's a manual, here's a book, and we'll be in a classroom for the next,
That's right.
9 days.
Yeah, we learn by doing in all sorts of respects, and you can't just follow a recipe. Recipes can more or less provide you with acceptable meals if that's your interest, but they can't produce that perfect dish, if I can put it that way.
Right.
That takes some experience and some sort of working with people that know how to do it, and so on. I mean, we haven't really talked about the COVID epidemic very much. We haven't talked about Mr. Trump, which maybe is a good thing. No, the COVID thing is, if you like, a piling on of the problems of the world. And of course it raises the question whether certain traditional activities, as we understand tradition, are possible ever again. You mean, will you and I ever fly in an airplane to a distant place to go on a holiday? What's going to happen to tourism in general? Is it in fact going to become completely local? Instead of flying off to Mexico this winter, maybe we'll have to go to Victoria Although if we all descend on Victoria in February, it's going to be pretty busy there, I would think.
Right.
But the story of North America sending jetting off to Mexico and places like that for winter holidays, that's not on this year.
Right.
Will it ever be on? The great arts scene that has been prolific in the last 30, 40 years, there's been a massive increase of the amount of cultural activities of
Right.
different kinds, not just fancy symphony orchestras,
Right.
but
All
folk
kinds.
festivals and rock concerts and the whole world of pop culture. It's sort of exploded in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
Social media make it even more magnificent in its extent, right?
There's always something going on.
There's
right?
always something going on. But, if we want to go to a live event, is that ever going to be possible again? Sports, think about professional sports, I love soccer, football as I prefer to call it. And it's on TV, but it doesn't have a crowd in the stands, in the bleachers,
And how long can they afford to keep those big arenas empty?
Correct.
And all those restaurants
right.
that are closing down?
Yeah.
But I think it's something that it'll bounce back in the future. But we're definitely in a decline now, where it's not going to be fun for the next 5 years, I think.
5 years, you think?
Well, I mean, I was hearing that economists were saying that this was a bigger economic crisis than the 2008 market crash of the, and so if that's the case, it's only going to get worse, unfortunately. It's a very pessimistic year this year, but I mean, it seems that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. But at the same time, for the majority of that don't have any wealth, we don't have much to lose, so that's okay. But I mean, it seems that maybe it'll benefit us in the future, where it might lower prices of property, it might make things a bit more affordable, but we can only cross our fingers and hope for that. It seems to be that the big companies that own all the real estate are able to weather the storm a lot better than most people that are living with debt, because they can take the losses.
Except that they presumably are confronting some fairly harsh realities.
Right.
I mean, if you travel around downtown Winnipeg, as I sometimes do, you notice a lot of shop fronts now that are really, really empty.
And so they're going to, either they have to sell or they have to lower the rent for companies to come.
Well, or alternatively, find some business that will go in there. But if everybody's going to be sort of working from home,
right, it'll be a problem.
How does that work?
Yeah.
I mean, if you buy your books, if you buy your clothes, if you buy your household gadgets on Amazon, why do you need to go to Polo Park or any sort of supermarket or mass mall? I mean, these are the interesting things. I mean, I talked to a neighbor who's a lawyer, and he's been working from home, but of course the traditional practice has been law firms have offices downtown, right?
Right.
He's probably discovered that he can do just as well and maybe avoid the overhead of renting
big
premises
costs, right?
By simply staying at home.
And before, there was a big part of the business was, well, we're professional. We have a nice big office, unlike the other firms. And that was the distinction, right? You could say, oh, they'd have nice big oak things, so I'm going to win my trial. But now it's, my kids are running in the background.
Investors made decisions about 2 years ago to engage in building office towers in downtown spaces still. And, at the back of the Winnipeg Arena, the downtown arena, is a big, big project that the True North people have been building in the last 2 or 3 years. It's coming to completion now. And part of it, of course, is a large area for office space. You really wonder whether they're going to be able to fill that office space. And it's true of any office initiative of, say, 2 years ago that's coming online now. In the middle of this pandemic, how are they going to be able to fill that space? I mean, will Manhattan ever come back? Because that's really the story of massive downtown office space and downtown living with all the attendant restaurants and entertainment and all the rest of it. Will it ever come back? I mean, it was Donald Trump that told us definitively he worries that New York will never come back.
It's quite
And
possible.
of course, he's perfectly intelligent and true in everything he says.
It's very true, because once we get into those habits, it's going to be hard to break them, especially that it's a lot easier to go online. And now the fact that people are realizing that they can do their businesses online, they can make their money online, where before it was maybe there was that reluctance or a generational issue with technology, or it was, there could be lots of issues, but it seems that it's been going that way, where it's going to be online, and it's not going to go back in a lot of fields, but it's going to be maybe less monopolized by big companies, and it'll be a lot more. You'll be able to get your services or or product out more than before, because you'll have you'll have that competition locally, right?
Well, look, I mean, I noticed a thread running through your particular conversation, Dominique, that you don't like big scale business and you dislike monopolies particularly. I think there's an imperative coming from technology which requires some things to be produced on a large scale. I mean, it's partly the story of industrialism. You can make per unit costs much smaller if you're producing for a mass market, and that means you have to have a big production system.
Right.
Even if we think about solving the climate crisis, we're going to need some factory somewhere that's going to be turning out massive amounts of solar panels, right? If we're going to go for hydro rather than coal-fired generating stations, we're going to need to have some company building hydro dams, and they're going to be pretty big companies, right? Maybe we do without cars, but as long as we have even electric cars, there's going to be fairly large companies making them, If you're making on a small scale, there are some specialist car companies that produce a few cars each year.
That's true.
But you have to pay a huge amount of money for them.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about, satisfying a mass market, you have to have,
no worries.
a fairly large corporation, it seems to me. Now, as long as you have other large corporations competing in the same market, I don't see any great problem. We think about the big three American cars. Well, there's still three of them, and they've had to still compete with, you can list half a dozen other big automobile companies in the world: Mercedes, BMW, Hyundai, Nissan, and on we go, Honda.
Right.
So, as long as there's many or several, I don't have huge problem with size.
But that is some competition where I think it's more, it's kind of like in Italy in the 90s and in the early 2000s, a lot of the districts, districts owned the trash industry, where they would take away the trash, and then they sold it off to the private sector, and then the private sector was owned by the mafia, and so they basically were at the point where they were extorting people and saying, you want to get rid of your trash, it's 10 euros a bag. And you're like, well, how can you raise the price that high overnight? It's like, well, your government, your local government just sold me the rights, the sole rights to pick up everybody's garbage without any regulation controlling it. So they were essentially capable, and then what happened was no one wanted to pay that, so the streets were lined with garbage, and to the point where those politicians, there was an election, and they lost, and so basically they had to rebuy it for an immense amount of money. And it seems to me that we can't privatize public goods or public spaces, and we can, that seems to be more and more the trend, where the government, gives out contracts, or instead of hiring its own staff to do the work, it just gives out contracts. And it seems to be, you know, the idea of having the government do it is great, but of course, whenever we see governments do it, it becomes inefficient or too expensive, or it falls in efficiency. So it's kind of hard to have a happy medium where we can marry the private sector that's responsible and have that competition, and having, like in Manitoba, the only liquor that you can buy is from the government, which is the government monopoly. Is it for the best or for the worst? There's arguments for both sides. If it makes the money for the government enough so that it lowers our taxes, why not? Fair enough, right? And there's like those compromises that people have to make, right?
Yes. Well, I think many of the problems that confront us are never quite either or problems. They're complex, and of course they're very specific to a certain kind of context. I mean, I don't think that if you're thinking about the relationship of corruption to public services in Naples, it's a very different story from that story in Winnipeg in Canada.
Right.
There is, I think, a gathering problem throughout the world of corruption. I really do feel that, and it's one of the other big sort of, what is it? The 7 horses of the apocalypse. I think it's one of the other horses of the apocalypse. We're losing the battle for the rule of law.
Right.
The importance of independent judges, uncorrupted judges, the role of money and bribery. I'm in the middle of reading this very, very fine book about Putin's Russia, and the degree of corruption that's there is phenomenal. And it's essentially a kind of kleptocracy.
They don't even bother, putting a face saying, we'll have a debate with the opposition in the election. They don't even bother putting up that kind of falsehood. They're just like...
But Russia's no different from, I take it, what goes on in Mexico, what goes on in parts of Italy, and what goes on in parts of our own society. I mean, we have corruption scandals even in the fair city of Winnipeg.
Right.
In the last 10 years, shall we say. And for some reason, the people that we know were involved have not been brought to justice.
Right. It seems more selfish, though, in North America than in maybe in Asia and in Europe, where the corruption is a lot more individual, and like it's not a big cabal. It's more, or in Mexico probably, but here it seems to be selfish negligence that really the corruption comes from.
Well, I think I see what you're saying, that it's almost like a kind of oversight on our part. I think, there's a fair degree of corruption in places, bigger cities in Canada, Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. I think you have corruption there. I mean, I remember visiting Montreal about 10 years ago and walking around downtown, and I noticed almost like kind of sort of missing teeth in the shop fronts of streets, buildings that had been sort of burnt out. And I started asking people what had happened, and that was the story of the various corruption schemes of protection rackets, and if you didn't pay the money, you were burnt out.
Right.
I remember a similar story of going to a part of Croatia just after the Balkan Wars, again seeing these missing shop fronts and houses that had been destroyed, otherwise a nice complete row of houses, but here and there gaps, burnt out sites. Why was that? This is in Croatia. Oh, they belong to Serbs, all right?
Wow.
So you have kind of ethnic rivalries and corruption. Anyway, you talked a little bit about nationalism. We still have nationalism, and of course we have it now in spades in the United States. Make America great again. The war with China that's imminent. What's happening now in Azerbaijan. We thought we had lost forever disputes over borders. You talked earlier about war as a sort of time of innovation when people were stressed but thought deeply
or even the
about
Cold War.
all sorts of things. Yeah. So we have the beauty of the human race, living with all these complexities and difficulties. It's the only world we know.
Right.
We must try and do the best we can. We must not give up hope. But it is that we are confronting some very difficult problems. Yeah.
We're at a bifurcation now of social values and technology, and I think we're going to marry everything together quite well. I think, whatever comes, we're going to pull through on the other side, transformed, and not knowing exactly what has happened, like a butterfly spreading its wings, not knowing how it became a butterfly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the concrescence where, in the heat of battle and the chaos is where the meat meets the metal and where we become who we really are.
Well, that's a very hopeful view, and I trust that it's true. I sort of sometimes are overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed by a sense of the difficulties. It's a very steep mountain that we have to climb now.
Right.
Now we can't say we shouldn't and can't, but it's going to take some diligence and application and some decency as well.
Right.
Some collective will. Yeah.
Well, we're very stubborn. We're not going to give up now.
Well, it's true. I mean, when we think about the flu epidemic of 100 years ago, I mean, there were millions of people that died in that epidemic.
Right.
Even thinking about the devastations of COVID, it's still that we're only talking in terms of hundreds of thousands of people dying rather than millions.
Right. But because of all the access to information,
Mm-hmm.
it seems
Mm-hmm.
immense.
And why did they not give up in 1918? As so many
Right.
people were dying on every hand. Why did they not give up in the 14th century with the Black Death?
Where half of
the
Europe was
bubonic plague?
decimated. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing how people kept going. People
Mhm.
see, it's quite a show.
Mhm.
I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been such a terrific few hours. I want to thank the viewers for sticking around with us. We basically covered everything that I can think of right now. So if you want to find us online, consciousqueries.com, on Instagram, Twitter, and on all the platforms for your podcasting needs. I'm your host, Dominic Persicino, with Dr. Alan Mills, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.